A breakthrough for scientists after they had a 20-minute conversation with a humpback whale.
Somewhere off the coast of a small Caribbean island, a hydrophone the size of a dinner plate is sitting on the ocean floor, quietly recording. It has been listening for years. Buried inside its recordings is something that sounds, at first, like nothing more than a series of clicks, the kind of noise you might mistake for a leaky pipe or a dripping faucet. But when scientists finally ran those clicks through an artificial intelligence system, the machine didn't just hear noise. It found grammar. It found rhythm. It found something that looks disturbingly close to a phonetic alphabet, built by an animal whose brain is roughly 6 times the size of a human's, and whose ancestors have been making these sounds since before we ever stood upright. And the strangest part isn't that whales communicate. We already knew that. The strangest part is what the AI found when it started listening closely enough to notice the difference between one whale sentence and another. For most of human history, our relationship with whales was painfully simple. We saw them, we were amazed by their size, and then, for a few brutal centuries, we hunted them for oil and bone. It wasn't until the 1970s that something shifted. Researchers recording humpback whales off Bermuda picked up long, structured, repeating sequences of moans and cries that didn't sound random at all. They sounded composed. Those recordings became the album songs of the humpback whale, and it did something no scientific paper ever could. It made ordinary people fall in love with an animal they had never really understood. That album is often credited with helping turn public opinion against commercial whaling. But even as the world grew to adore whale song, scientists were left with a much harder problem. Loving the sound of something is not the same as understanding what it means. For nearly 50 years, that's where things stalled. We had recordings. We didn't have translations. The turning point didn't come from a marine lab. It came from an unlikely comparison to outer space. A marine biologist named David Gruber had spent years working with sharks, coral, and deep-sea creatures, but he became fixated on a different question. If humanity ever want to practice at recognizing an alien intelligence, why not start with the most alien-seeming intelligence already living on Earth? He looked at the decades-long search for extraterrestrial radio signals, the actual SETI project, and wondered whether the same pattern-finding tools used to scan the cosmos could be pointed at the ocean instead. Whales, after all, are about as different from us as an intelligent creature can be. They live in a fluid, three-dimensional world. They navigate by sound instead of sight, and their closest relatives split off from ours tens of millions of years ago. If we wanted a rehearsal for first contact, Gruber figured we didn't need a radio telescope. We needed a hydrophone. That idea became Project SETI, the Cetacean Translation Initiative, and it set out to do something no research team had seriously attempted before. Not just record whale sound, but decode its structure. Gruber didn't build this team alone, and that matters because the project's real innovation wasn't a single piece of technology, it was the unusual mix of people forced to work in the same room. Marine biologists who had spent literal decades in the water sat alongside machine learning engineers who had never touched a boat. One of the most important people on the team is Shane Jarrow, a biologist who has spent well over a decade tracking a single community of sperm whales in the waters around the island of Dominica. Jarrow didn't just record these whales. He learned to recognize individuals, followed families across generations, and built a catalog of behavior that gave the sound context. Without that grounding, an AI model would just be pattern-matching noise with no idea what any of it related to. It's the pairing of that ground truth fieldwork with modern natural language processing that makes SETI different from earlier attempts to study animal sound. The biologists supplied the meaning. The engineers supplied the scale. Dominica turned out to be close to perfect for this kind of work. The island's coastline drops off into extremely deep water almost immediately, which means sperm whales, animals that dive over a kilometer down a hunt, pass close to shore instead of staying far out at sea. Add in a resident population that returns year after year, families whose voices researchers had already spent years learning to recognize, and you have something rare, a natural laboratory where a team could realistically attempt to gather enormous amounts of data instead of settling for a handful of recordings. When Project SETI officially launched in 2020, backed by a large grant from the TED Audacious Project, that's exactly what the plan called for: an ambitious underwater listening network designed to capture not just isolated clicks, but who is clicking, when, and in what social situation. The listening setup itself is deceptively simple in concept and enormously difficult in practice. Arrays of hydrophones sit on the seafloor, always recording, always listening, forming a kind of underwater microphone grid. Because there are multiple hydrophones spread across a wide area, researchers can compare the tiny differences in when a sound reaches each device and work backward to figure out roughly where in the water it came from. And, when combined with visual identification of surfacing whales, whose voice it likely was, that alone was a huge step forward from older research, which mostly involved a boat, a single recorder, and a lot of guesswork about which whale was actually making a given sound. But sound alone only tells you half the story. To understand why a whale is clicking, researchers also needed to know what the whale's body was doing at that exact moment. Was it diving to hunt, resting near the surface, or interacting with family members? That's where the project's robotics team came in. Rather than forcing a diver to physically wrestle a sensor onto an enormous animal, engineers developed non-invasive suction cup tags that could be gently placed using drones. These tags record motion, depth, and orientation alongside the whale's sounds, giving researchers a behavioral fingerprint to match against the acoustic one. It's a delicate operation. Pilots have to match a drone's speed to a moving whale and time a soft drop onto its back, but it means scientists finally get both halves of the picture: what was said and what was happening when it was said. None of this technology would matter without an unprecedented amount of raw data, and this is really where SETI breaks from every previous attempt to study whale sound. Earlier research projects might have gathered a few dozen hours of recordings over a season. SETI's stated goal was to gather millions of vocalizations, a scale of data that simply wasn't achievable with older recording equipment, and that modern machine learning models actually need in order to detect subtle statistical patterns a human ear would never catch. Machine learning doesn't work by being told the rules of a language up front. It works by being shown enormous numbers of examples and finding the regularities on its own. That's exactly the approach the team took with sperm whale codas, the short, Morse code-like bursts of clicks that make up the core of sperm whale communication. Before any of that data could be useful, though, researchers had to solve a much more basic problem. How do you get a computer to see sound in a way it can analyze? The answer was to convert audio recordings into spectrograms, visual representations of sound frequency and intensity over time. Once whale clicks existed as images instead of just waveforms, machine learning models built for pattern recognition could be turned loose on them, sorting through the recordings to isolate codas from background noise like snapping shrimp, boat engines, and waves. It's a step that sounds almost mundane compared to talk of decoding a language, but it's the foundation everything else was built on. Without turning sound into something a model could visually parse, none of the later discoveries would have been possible. What the models eventually found was more intricate than most researchers expected. Sperm whale codas aren't just simple, uniform bursts. They vary by rhythm, how quickly or slowly the clicks within a coda are spaced. They vary by tempo overall. And researchers identified something they started calling ornamentation. Small extra clicks tacked onto the beginning or end of a coda that don't change the basic rhythm but seem to carry additional meaning, almost like inflection. There's also a subtler feature the team refers to as rubato, tiny, expressive variations in timing within a coda, similar to the way a musician might stretch or compress a note for feeling rather than strict tempo. Put together, researchers have compared this system to something functioning a bit like vowels and consonants in human speech, a set of building blocks that can combine in different ways to produce a much larger set of possible words than anyone assumed a click-based system could support. In 2024, this line of research led to widely reported findings describing something close to a whale phonetic alphabet, evidence that these codas aren't a fixed, limited vocabulary, but a combinatorial system capable of generating far more variety than a simple signal set. Here's where the story takes the turn that surprised even the researchers. Many scientists assumed that if whales had any kind of structured communication system, it would be functional and narrow. Warnings, mating calls, basic coordination during a hunt. What the data actually showed was something more socially layered. The same codotype can shift meaning depending on subtle timing differences and on the social situation it's used in. Different whale family groups, often called clans, appear to use distinct dialects. Sets of codas are shared within a clan but differ from clan to clan, the way regional accents differ between people from different parts of the same country. Researchers have also found that these communication patterns are learned rather than instinctive, passed down within family lines rather than hardwired from birth. That single detail reframes the whole picture. This isn't just a signaling system for survival. It looks like a form of culture, a set of communication patterns tied to identity, family, and social belonging, refined and passed down across generations of whales that, in some documented cases, researchers have followed and recognized individually for over a decade. That last point is worth sitting with for a second because it's easy to let fly by. We're not just talking about whales making noise at each other. We're talking about a communication system that appears to encode who you're related to, which social group you belong to, and possibly how you feel, expressed through subtle variations in rhythm and timing that no human ear, unaided, would ever have picked apart. It took a machine trained on an enormous data set, built alongside decades of patient fieldwork identifying individual whales, to even notice these distinctions existed in the first place. So where does this actually go next? Understanding structure is one thing. The team's stated long-term ambition is to move from analysis towards some form of interaction, using patterns identified in the data to construct playback sequences and observe how whales respond, essentially testing whether elements of the coda system can be used in a two-way exchange rather than only studied passively. It's important to be honest about where that work currently stands. This is early stage, experimental, and the researchers involved have been careful not to claim they've achieved fluent conversation with another species. What they have built is a much clearer map of the system's grammar than existed before, and a framework for testing hypotheses about meaning going forward. Anyone telling you whales are chatting away with scientists in real time is getting ahead of the actual science. What's real is arguably just as interesting. For the first time, there's a data-backed structural model of how one non-human species organizes its vocal communication, built at a scale no research team could have managed by ear alone. That ambition also raises a set of questions the SETI team takes seriously, and that are worth raising here too. If you're building tools designed to eventually interact with wild animals using their own communication patterns, you have an obligation to think hard about the consequences. Could introducing human-generated playback disrupt natural social behavior? Could it interfere with how whale calves learn their own dialects? These aren't hypothetical concerns tacked onto a press release. They're the kind of ethical questions any responsible research group has to wrestle with before moving from listening to interacting, and reputable teams working in this space have been explicit that any future experiments need to prioritize the animal's well-being over the novelty of the achievement. There's also a broader implication here that goes beyond whales entirely. The tools built for this project, machine learning models designed to find structure in a completely unfamiliar signal, with no assumed grammar and no dictionary to start from, are in principle the same kind of tools you'd want if humanity ever did pick up a genuinely unfamiliar signal from somewhere else entirely. That's not a guarantee of anything. It's simply a reminder that the techniques being refined to understand an intelligence that evolved in the ocean, completely separate from our own evolutionary path, are general enough that they don't only apply to whales. Learning how to find pattern and meaning in a system built by minds nothing like ours turns out to be useful no matter where that system originated. And maybe that's the real headline hiding underneath all of this. We spent centuries treating whales as a resource, first for their oil, later almost as scenery, something beautiful to admire from a boat. What this research suggests, cautiously and without overclaiming, is that we've been sharing the planet with animals that have something resembling dialects, something resembling learned culture, and a communication system with far more internal structure than blunt survival calls would require. We don't have a whale-to-English dictionary. We're not carrying on conversations with sperm whales. But we now have real evidence that when a whale clicks, there's more going on beneath the surface than we ever gave him credit for. And it took building an entirely new kind of listening system, one click at a time, to finally start hearing it. If a discovery like this changes how you think about intelligence on this planet, that's probably the point. We're only a few years into actually being able to ask these questions with real data behind them, and there's a lot more listening still to do.